Can you tell us what that means? Because this is a mind bender of a concept that really blows reality out of the water as we know it.
Some aspect of your awareness, most of which is unconscious, is spread out in time, some of it going into the future. If you want to manifest something, you don't push it, you pull it from the future. If you want to do force of will type of experiments or manifestations, it's not like you mentally push it into being. Rather, you intend or you affirm that it is already done in the future, and now the world will catch up to it.
Hi everyone, welcome back. I'm Michael Sandler, your host on Inspire Nation. If you've ever wanted to attract anything into your life, then do we have the Real Magic Show for you. Today I'll be talking with Dr. Dean Radin, Chief Scientist at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, author or co-author of over 250 technical and popular articles, 36 book chapters, 4 books now, including the award-winning The Conscious Universe and Tangled Minds, the 2014 Silver Nautilus Book Award winner Supernormal, and his latest, another all-time new favorite of mine, Real Magic. And that's just what I want to talk with him about today, about ancient wisdom, modern science, and a guide to the secret power of the universe. That, plus we'll talk about Peter Venkman and Ghostbusters, PsyQuest and synchronicities, sheeps and goats, 8-foot curveballs, Play-Doh and voodoo dolls, kissing mules on the snout, and what in the world Spider-Man underwear has to do with anything. So welcome to the show, Dean. Are you ready to shine?
I believe I am, yes.
Woohoo! So before we dive right into things, and for everybody out there, Dean is a huge hero of mine for the work that he does. When did you realize you've been studying magic from a scientific perspective for 39 or 40 years?
Just shortly before I decided to write this book.
And what flipped that switch from you to realize, hey, wait, this is magic?
Well, as an academic, you are taught that magic is superstitious. Mm-hmm. It's not something that a sober scientist ought to entertain. And unfortunately, even within parapsychology, which is the study of these kinds of phenomena, it's within the mold of the academic system. So, and as evidenced, among other things, by being a member of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, at AAAS. So the Parapsychological Association, of which I happen to be president this year, was elected a member of the AAAS because it is a scientific society. Well, scientists and magic don't mix. In fact, in science, the idea that you're magical thinking, you propose a theory and somebody dismisses it as magic, that's considered an insult because the connotation of magic is something happens and there's no reason why it happened. So the Parapsychological Association, myself, most of my colleagues have strongly rejected any affiliation or association with magic because we know that it's a taboo. And in fact, the largest book that tells the state of the art of parapsychology today is called the Handbook of Parapsychology for the 21st Century. It's an update of a book called the Handbook of Parapsychology that was written in the 1970s. And it's a big fat book, big size, with lots of articles in it, and the word magic doesn't show up in the index. So it is taboo. On the other hand, for many years I've been interested in trying to figure out why has it been so difficult to take psychic phenomena, which empirically we're pretty sure that it's a real thing. Why is it so difficult to get a proper scientific understanding of it? And so as I began to dive into that issue, I decided that one of the ways to look for clues was to look for other worldviews, because science is essentially a worldview. We don't think of it in those terms, but it is a way that we view the world, and every worldview has blinders. And so I wanted to know, what are the blinders that are preventing us from seeing what's there? So I decided first to look at the Eastern esoteric traditions, and that turned into my book, Supernormal, and then the Western esoteric traditions, which turned into Real Magic. So when you do this job of going through the esoteric traditions, both in the East and the West, you immediately bump up into psychic phenomena. And you bump up into the variations that are everything from pretty small stuff, like clairvoyance is considered elementary, to big stuff, like levitation, and everything in between. And I thought, okay, well, that's a good clue, because it means that from these other traditions that go all the way back to shamanism, so they're at least 10,000, if not longer, years old, maybe they knew something that we don't know, or maybe they don't have the same blinders. So in going through that exercise, figuring out why was there a belief in magic from these other traditions that are called esoteric because they've been suppressed, it became very, very clear that magic and psi are basically exactly the same thing. Psi is modern terminology for these ancient phenomena, and it also then provides a clue as to how do these phenomena work. And so my challenge in the book was to figure out, then, taking the scientific perspective, how do we take the clues from the esoteric traditions and make them compatible with the scientific worldview? Because we can't throw away science. It works too well. But nevertheless, something has to change. So the exercise in the book was describing the way I imagined it could change.
Awesome. And I want to dive more into that. A few things that come to mind are first off, what are the blinders of science?
The blinders are that science has been extremely good at studying the objective world. It is not very good at studying the subjective world. Now, as a psychologist, I would say, well, no, psychology is all about studying the inner world, except it's not exactly true. A lot of psychology is about studying behavior. It's not exactly the same as behaviorism 50 years ago, but still, most of it, and even in the neurosciences, it's all about taking either observable measures or measures that can be objectified, like when people fill out a questionnaire. But it's not getting at the core. And the core in any kind of subjective experience is the experience itself. Science does not know how to study consciousness itself. And so this gives rise in a kind of a naive reality sense that the world is made out of separate objects and space and time are absolutes and all of the things of classical physics, which up until 100 years ago is all we had. But now we, of course, have more modern physics where all of our previous assumptions are basically wrong. So we need to think out of the box, essentially.
It's interesting because that out of the box is present in every single known culture since the beginning of known history until 150 years ago, and even Newton himself practiced magic.
Yeah, Newton spent a lot more of his time on alchemy than he did on any of his scientific work. And that he wasn't even known until about 100 years ago when the biographers discovered that he had this gigantic cache of additional writings on alchemy that all of the previous biographers ignored. And as it turns out that many of the great scientists throughout history have been interested in esoteric ideas. Even the founders, most of the founders of quantum mechanics were deeply into the Vedas, into the Upanishads. So there's kind of a mythology about the way scientists are and how they get their inspirations and how they work and all that. The mythology is the person in the white coat who is sober and serious and probably a nerd and all the rest, and tightly focused on analytical ways of thinking. And certainly some subset of scientists fit into that. But a lot of them don't. A lot of them are human beings as well. And as humans, we have all kinds of strange experiences. And if you pay attention to those experiences, it's very difficult to maintain what amounts to an illusion that we're just absolutely rational all the time, and we don't admit that there are other ways of gaining information.
And if we go back in time, we go well on back in time to one of the founders of the way we think today, also was studying this, Plato.
Plato, Pythagoras, most of the Greek philosophers. Yeah, there's an unbroken thread that goes back as far as we can see. The main difference today is that you go to someone like Francis Bacon, who is considered maybe the father of empiricism. So that was one of the key elements of the development of modern science, or the scientific method as we know today. Well, of course, he was very interested in esoteric ideas. Everyone was saturated in these ideas at the time. And he even recommended, way back when, hundreds of years ago, that if one wanted to study the force of imagination, which is the way he would put it, that you could do it by rolling dice and seeing whether your intention would affect the roll of dice. So in 2 strokes, he had both an experimental method to test what amounts to a kind of magic, and the use of statistics to do that. So he foresaged by hundreds of years what we are doing today as a means of studying these kinds of phenomena. But notice the difference in that when he made that proposal at the time, science hadn't created the constraints or the strictures that it has now in terms of what you can study. So most people don't study these ideas, even though the founder of the empirical method said, well, sure, you could study it.
And it's fascinating because you do study it, and then there are strange things like these articles that come out in like Wired that say, well, they're completely unrepeatable, these studies, but we're talking about 6 sigma results. Maybe you can share what that means.
Well, a 6 sigma result is, the term 6 sigma is used more in industry than elsewhere, but statisticians know what it is too. It means that you've reached a level of reliability that the odds against chance are about 1 billion to 1. So, and this is not exactly how it's used in an industrial context. There, it's used more in terms of the reliability of a device. So if you have like a hard drive and it starts making mistakes, people are not going to buy it. So you need to have an extremely reliable device. Well, once you get past around 6 sigma, it means that your quality control is so good that the likelihood of making an error is really, really small. In an experimental context, it means that you keep doing experiments again and again, and your confidence that you can assign to the results that you're seeing in these experiments gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So a 6 sigma result is sufficient to say, yeah, we think it's really real. And by the way, in physics, the threshold where you begin to say, okay, I think we actually found something is 5 sigma. The Higgs boson that was found by CERN was given the Nobel Prize based on a 5 sigma result.
Wow. So what are some of the experiments that are getting 6 sigma results, and how long have they been going on for?
There's a number of classes. One is telepathy. There's a certain type of telepathy experiment that has been done for at least 40 years now. It might be almost 50 years, and repeated thousands of times. The number of experiments is something like 120, but within each experiment there may be 30 or 40 trials. So lots and lots of sessions of this particular type of experiment. That's over 6 sigma. Another is presentiment, which is an unconscious form of precognition. There are also conscious forms of precognition, which also reach the 6 sigma level. The studies involving random number generators, which is a target for intention to see if you can push the results of these electronic choices, like coin flips. Those are 6 sigma. And another is a large-scale worldwide version of that experiment called the Global Consciousness Project, where you have lots of random number generators around the world, and you see if they are correlated with large world events. They shouldn't be under the null hypothesis, but they do correlate up to 7 sigma. So those are a couple of examples of experiments that have been repeated again and again. One of the reasons they're repeated, by the way, is simply that if somebody does an experiment, like I did one of the early presentiment experiments, and I got a really good result. So good that I had to repeat it again and again because I wasn't sure if I could believe it.
And can you tell us what that means? Because this is a mind bender of a concept that really blows reality out of the water as we know it.
What, presentiment?
Yeah.
Oh, Well, all of it blows reality out of the water, except that it is reality. It's just that it's not the usual sort of thing that we think about all the time. So a presentiment experiment is part of a long line of experiments that are using physiological measures for detecting an effect, rather than asking somebody to perform a miracle on demand in the laboratory. If you ask somebody to be psychic on demand, many people can't do that. They get anxious and then they can't do anything. So a physiological-based experiment is where we do an experiment where we're recording your heart rate or your skin conductance or your EEG or some aspect of your body where we're able to see what's going on at an unconscious level rather than conscious awareness. So a presentiment experiment in its simplest form, you would sit down in front of a computer screen, we'd wire you up to measure some aspect of your body, and then you would press a button and see a blank screen for 5 seconds. Then a picture would suddenly pop up. Well, the picture could be very calm or it could be very emotional. And then the picture would go away after 3 seconds and you get a little time to relax, and then you do it again. You might do this 40 times in one session. There are many variations on this idea. So the idea of it is that if some aspect of your awareness extends through time, which is precognition, then maybe your body begins to feel that before the event unfolds, and you can detect that feeling unconsciously through things like a change in your heart rate, change in your skin conductance, change in pupil dilation, change in virtually every aspect of the nervous system in the body. So that's the experiment that has been done many times by many labs around the world, and overall, when you repeat it again and again, it shows that a matter of seconds before a randomly selected picture shows up, the body is already moving in the direction that it's going to respond. So if you're about to see an emotional picture, all of the indicators in your body are going into a direction of, I'm becoming aroused. And if you're about to see a calm picture, all of the indicators in your body are remaining calm. So we did an example of this. I was interviewed for CBS News, one of the shows, and the people, the news people, always want to see an experiment. So I had the way to do that, by the way, is to have the news correspondent be a subject, not show somebody, but have them do it themselves. Cool. And when you do that, it's live on camera, and you never know what the result's going to be of any given experiment. You hope it's good, but who knows? So this was a version of a presentiment experiment using an eye tracker. So you have a laptop computer, and there's like a bar at the bottom of the computer that has 2 cameras that looks at your eyes and measures pupil dilation. Yep. We know that when you see something emotional, your pupils dilate. So the prediction in this experiment was that before you saw an emotional picture, your pupils would also dilate. And you're looking at a black screen, so there's nothing there to push it by the illumination level. And before a calm picture, your pupils would remain at some baseline level. So we had the correspondent do the test, and it came out beautifully. She got a statistically significant result in a 5-minute test, showing that her eyes her pupils were dilating more before seeing the emotional picture than the calm. So that was a nice outcome, but it doesn't always work, which is why we have to run many trials and many people, and what we're getting isn't what's true on average. Well, what's true on average is that some aspect of your awareness, most of which is unconscious, is spread out in time, some of it going into the future. So this particular experiment, you can only look about 10 seconds into the future, and it's a limitation of the experimental design. Other kinds of experiments, like remote viewing, can look out weeks or months in advance. So there doesn't seem to be any limitation in terms of how far one can, quote, see.
And can you tell us a little bit about, well, before we go to remote viewing, first off, can not only we see forward, but are the experiments suggesting that we can affect things backwards?
When you start thinking hard about the nature of precognition, it will make your brain hurt. And so I'd recommend people only do it for short periods of time, like 30 seconds, and then go do something else. The reason it makes your brain hurt is because it suggests that our ordinary way of thinking about causality can be reversed. And that's a major problem for a lot of reasons. A big problem in science is that when we talk about the mechanism of action, how does something work? What we mean is, what are the causal links? The causal links are always thought to go forward in time. And we point to things like the second law of thermodynamics and other ways of thinking about why time only seems to go in one direction. And what is probably the case is that the second law of thermodynamics is a special case because time apparently can go backwards. In fact, maybe there's no time at all. It's just an inference that we make based on the sequence of events that we see. So the other thing is that at least at the quantum scale, we're not so sure yet about the macroscopic world, but at the quantum scale, the idea of something being precognized or forecast might be exactly the same as influence. Like, it's difficult to tell the difference between influencing something and precognizing something. Even in these experiments, it's difficult. So in a presentiment experiment, it could be that since the pictures are randomly selected immediately before they show up, and typically by a truly random number generator, maybe somebody gets a sense of, I think I want to see an emotional picture now. And they influence the random generator, and sure enough, they get the emotional picture. And at other times people would say, I don't think I want to see an emotional picture, and they don't. So what's causing what? Are they getting aroused because the future is going to be a certain way, or are they making that future? So there is a way to test this idea. In these experiments, you can use, for emotional pictures, you can put in pictures that you know people want to see, but they will never admit it. These are mainly erotic pictures. And then you can see whether are they seeing more erotic pictures than you would expect by chance. Because after all, they should be selected randomly, like coin flips. Some people do. Not everyone, but some people get a significantly more number of pictures that they want to see than they should be seeing by chance. Because we don't see this in everybody, we don't know that it's a psychokinetic effect in those cases or precognitive. That's where it becomes very muddy to try to figure out what's causing what. I did report an experiment, or I described an experiment in the book, where I used a metaphor of pitching a curveball.
8-foot curveball.
A curveball. An 8-foot curve, yeah. Normally, about the maximum is about 1.5 feet. So if somebody tossed a curveball and it went 8 feet, how could you explain such a thing? And I use that metaphor because it's really about an experiment that is simulating that kind of effect to see when somebody influences a random number generator, of which there's a lot of evidence that something like that happens. Is it due to some kind of precognition, like knowing the right time to intervene with the system, or are people pushing it? Some of the evidence suggests that people can push it, like your intention causes the effect, and others suggest that it's stranger than that. So this experiment, I won't bother to go through it in detail because it takes too long to describe, but the bottom line of that experiment was that people did an experiment with a random generator that got a result, which from one perspective you can interpret as their intention was imposed upon the output of the generator and caused it to behave a certain way. But that's not what the analysis of the experiment showed, because this was done in a slightly unusual way, which allowed you to look at the sequence in time. Well, the sequence in time suggested that the intention started in the future, and then it rippled backwards towards the person who placed the intention. The reason why I reported that experiment in this book is because part of the magical lore is that if you want to do force of will type of experiments or manifestations, it's not like you mentally push it into being. Rather, you intend or you affirm that it is already done in the future, and now the world will catch up to it. This precise way that the world does catch up to it, we may not know. It may be that you're probabilistically tweaking something in the future, and everything else will conspire in such a way as to move towards that future. So the nice thing about this idea is that it is experimentally testable. That's what that experiment was about. And we've done lots of other experiments like that, all of them kind of suggesting that If you want to manifest something, you don't push it. You pull it from the future.
Can you tell us more about that? And in fact, maybe we'll talk about a few of these here. For example, let's talk about what's a sigil? S-I-G-I-L.
A sigil is a symbol that stands for an intention. So I describe in the book how to make one simple form of sigil, but it's really any symbol. People are wearing religious symbols and all kinds of symbols all the time. You have a symbol, the mala beads.
There, and yep.
Yeah. So these can act as reminders of something that you wish to keep either in the foreground or the background of your mind. They can also be crafted especially for a particular intention. So from a magical practice point of view, you would create a sigil for some outcome. I want a blue car. You can make a sigil for that. Once you create the sigil, it's typically drawn on a piece of paper or something. You charge it mentally, meaning that you focus as much intention as you possibly can and motivation through the symbol, so to speak. You cast it upon the world, and then you set it aside, or you burn the piece of paper, or you just get rid of it, because very similarly to how you don't push a random number generator, you can't push these things by praying constantly. It doesn't work that way. You need to create the intention and then release it, because the action is taking place at a much deeper unconscious level. So you put huge amounts of motivation into the creation and charging of the sigil, and then you drop it. And in some cases, you may remind yourself every so often by putting a piece of paper somewhere that reminds you that it's still in play, but you can't focus on it too much, because your surface level analytical mind will get in the way. So that's the basic idea of a sigil. Put a lot of intention on drawing something with the two meanings of draw. You are drawing something, making a sketch, and you are drawing it in a teleological way. The same is true for spell casting. For writing magic, spell has two meanings. You spell a word because the word like CAT is stands in a pointer to a feline somewhere. But the spelling of it, the casting of the spell, is to take that symbol and make it real. So spell casting and spelling, in the sense of becoming a symbol for the thing you wish, are both together, simply the same way that drawing is.
This makes me think of Egyptian hieroglyphics for some reason.
Maybe, although there's plenty of ways that people have learned how to write. I mean, cuneiform as well, which is more abstract. I suppose it's possible the hieroglyphics were used in that way because Egyptians were heavily steeped in magic, of course. But I don't know. That's an interesting question. I'll look into that to see whether or not they had a sense that the drawing of their images was drawing it into reality. I don't know.
Very, very, very cool. I want to dive into some more of these practices. Before we do, there's some very interesting experiments that we can all learn from about sheeps and goats.
The sheeps and goats. The sheeps are the believers in ESP, and the goats are the non-believers in ESP. The reason I talk about this in the book is because one of the factors that is said to modulate magic, this goes all the way back to shamanism, is whether or not you believe in the magic. If you don't believe in magic, it doesn't work very well. If you do, it works really well. So the sheep-goat experiment was first devised about 70 years ago by a psychologist named Gertrude Schmeidler, who was at the City College of New York, and she was interested in ESP, and she got the idea that maybe one of the reasons that some people are very skeptical about ESP is because it just doesn't happen to them. Well, why not? Well, maybe they don't want it to happen. So this is a curious case where your intention, your psychological filters determine what you see. If you don't want to see something, you won't see it. But that doesn't mean it isn't there. It just means your attention has been deflected in some way. So she devised an experiment where you take a classroom of students, you ask each one of them, what do you think about ESP? And then you can separate them into two groups, one that tends to believe, one that tends not to believe. So they're the sheep and the goats. Then you have them take exactly the same ESP test, and now you look at their results. Well, she found that, as she expected, that the sheep tend to do positively in these experiments and the goats don't. And you can then make a prediction that when you take the results of those two groups, the comparison between them will be significant in a predictable way. So that experiment, as I said, has been done hundreds of times using many different kinds of experiments, but everyone involved in the test, in a given test, will take the same experiment. And there's no doubt that your openness and willingness to believe in this case, in ESP, modulates whether or not the effect works. So in some respects, this shouldn't be surprising because we know that expectation drives everything in your experience. If you expect that you're going to have a crappy day, sure enough, things will happen that will reinforce that expectation, and vice versa. So as your show is about inspiration, essentially, if you expect to be inspired, you will find all kinds of things that will be inspiring because your filters are being adjusted in such a way that you can see it. Because one of the estimates of how much of the world is impinging on you at any given time versus what you're consciously aware of it is roughly 1 trillion to 1. There's huge amounts of stuff coming in, and we trickle it down to a very thin slice for what we're aware of. So you can adjust that, and your world becomes completely different. So the same is true for something like ESP. You don't believe it, you're not going to experience it.
Although hopefully, even if you don't believe it, when your hair goes up on end and you decide to pull the car to the left at the last second, you decide whether to believe it or not afterwards.
Well, yes, unconsciously, these phenomena are happening all the time. In fact, one of my colleagues, Jim Carpenter, has this notion that we shouldn't call it the sixth sense. We should call ESP the first sense, because it is really there all the time. The world is interconnected in very strange ways. Time may or may not be the way we think it is, on and on and on. We are constructing the world that we live in, and it's reinforced by when we compare notes with other people. But you get a bunch of psychics together or mediums, their reality is very different than the average person on the street. They will see entities, they will feel things and whatever. It's only because they're open to it. So our unconscious is aware of lots more than we are consciously. And it's absolutely true that if you get an intuitive hit to do this versus that, more than likely you should follow that intuitive hit, especially if it comes with a sense of certainty. It's an unusual sense of certainty. So one of the definitions of a noetic experience is an intuitive sense that carries with it a conviction that this is true. And you don't know why it's true, but the conviction is an important element. So if you get that, go with it.
Let's talk about, and I want to dive into a bunch of them, particularly writing in a little bit here, but you mentioned the importance of a disciplined meditation practice for helping with magic.
Right. So when you look at the factors in magical practice that come up again and again and again for thousands of years, one that we've mentioned already is belief. So belief is part of it. Another is that the magic does not happen at the conscious level. You can't simply have a whim about something and expect that that's going to take place. It might lead you eventually, but the momentary whim of I want to have those shoes, well, you just go buy the shoes. But it's not going to happen magically. The magic happens, and this was one of the clues that I was paying attention to and that ended up writing the book. The magic happens at very deep levels of awareness, usually below the level of what we think of as surface conscious awareness. So magicians call it Gnosis, Gnosis. So the Gnosis state is very similar to what a yogi would say as samadhi. It's a mystical union state. And at that level of awareness, there are no distinctions anymore, no ordinary distinctions. It's a non-dual state. So at these levels of gnosis, the distinction between you and me has dissolved, between now and then has dissolved, between objects. It all becomes one thing. So you could, if you wish, go into a state of what a yogi might say is ananda. It's simply bliss. And you can stay there, and who wouldn't want to be in bliss? But to do something in that state is what a yogi would call the siddhis. You act within this state of union. And then the magician does the same thing. They go to the state of gnosis. You apply a little bit of intention, and what would normally be an intention at the surface level where you have a whim about something, a whim at the gnosis level can push mountains, because it's at such a deep level that it's the place where, for want of a better term, the creative spark comes from, that emerges from awareness into the physical world. So what I'm saying now is about the lore. We don't know this yet from a scientific perspective, but as a way of thinking about how can these psychic phenomena be true, that level of description starts to become more and more plausible. And we might go into that a little bit later, but the notion of it is that we try to figure out from a surface level description of reality how psychic phenomena can work, how magic can work, how the yogic siddhis can work. None of it makes any sense. You immediately, as a scientist, start thinking about forces and fields and particles and things like that we're used to dealing with. Experiments don't work in that sense. The ability to do these things doesn't work very well. In fact, I don't think it works at all. So we need to start thinking about more comprehensive and slightly more abstract ways of imagining the world. And the magical traditions say it's happening at these deep states of awareness, of gnosis. So how do you get into gnosis? Well, you meditate. That's probably the safest way, but you could also take psychedelics that will thrust you into it, whether you want to or not. Some people are more comfortable with dancing or drumming or lots of other techniques, which are all kind of in the domain of meditation. And all of them are designed to push you out of your ordinary state of awareness. So that's why when people want to produce magic because they want things to happen, or they want to have better control of their life, they'll meditate for 5 minutes and nothing happened. Well, if you're really talented and very lucky and fortunate, you might be one of those 1 in a million people who actually doesn't need to practice. We just can do it somehow. But for the vast majority of people, you need at least a little bit of talent, but a lot of practice. So I've been meditating for about 40 years. I started in 1970 when I was in college, and on and off, not continuously, but of probably 10 years worth of that I can consider to be time of practice. I can count in terms of minutes the amount of time that I would think that I was in a samadhi state or a gnosis state. Minutes after thousands and thousands and thousands of hours of practice. And that's because I clearly am not all that talented in that domain. But I can get there. With enough practice, you can get there. And then some people, as I said, are just much more adept and are able to get there a lot quicker.
Thank you. There's a practice I teach people, automatic writing program, where we teach people how to go into a meditative state, kind of shut off the thinking mind, go to that larger sea, and write from that place. Maybe we can even talk briefly about some of the common channeling books, because going into that quiet place and writing is something that many of the authors who we think are linear thinkers, whatever that means, may be anything but. They're magicians.
Well, we're all magicians. By virtue of being sentient creatures, we have the same spark, the little sea of consciousness inside your head. It's made out of the same stuff as the universal sea, the big sea. So if we imagine that that the universe is emerging out of that primordial big C consciousness, which is part of the fabric of reality. The scientific challenge is, how do we understand how you start from something as abstract as consciousness,
Yeah.
and make it emerge into physicality? There are, as I talk in the book, there are people working on that problem from a scientific perspective, and not only that, from the top tier of science today. These are thought leaders in science who are working on that issue. I don't think they think of it in terms of magic,
Mhm.
but that is exactly what it is. It's all about starting from an informational concept of reality, or a symbolic or a mathematical concept of reality, and turning that somehow into the world as it manifests. So that's the leading edge of science. And that was actually the other aspect of the book that I'm trying to portray here, that when you have concepts that go back to the beginning of recorded history, but have been pushed aside because we didn't know what to do with them, maybe they're trying to tell us something. And maybe science finally is becoming mature enough to be able to look back at that and say, well, maybe we were a little bit premature to imagine that it was nonsense. And maybe it really is such a deep level of understanding about the nature of reality that science needed to mature to get up to the point where it was able to talk about it. So I'm hoping the book becomes kind of a catalyst to help people think about it in these terms. Because this is a little bit of deflection from what you were asking, but
Go for it.
it's a riff. One of the reasons why I see scientists who really, really don't like anything about psychic phenomena and strongly resist it is because they get the sense that something like precognition cannot be true. Because if it's true, we have to throw away all of our textbooks and we have to start over again. And it doesn't make any sense. To which I agree. So the challenge is, how do you start from this crazy consciousness magic perspective and have it fit into what we know about science? So I came up with something. I don't know whether I read it somewhere or I simply dreamt it up or something, but I thought of it and suddenly it became perfectly obvious to me that the whole history of science and the whole history of any cosmology that people have dreamt up, it starts with a core idea, and then some things don't fit, so you make it a little bit more comprehensive, and then you keep making it more and more comprehensive. So a good example is classical physics, which in 1900 was considered absolutely finished until a year later when it completely fell apart and quantum mechanics and relativity started. So we didn't throw away classical physics, we simply expanded it and saw it as a special case. So my proposal then is that our current scientific understanding is a special case of a more comprehensive worldview. The more comprehensive worldview is one that imagines that consciousness really is fundamental. It's more fundamental than the physical world. So that's just an assumption, like everything else in science is assumptions about the way things work. But if you take that assumption and you simply say that, let's just say consciousness is a thing, somehow the physical world emerges from it. Once it has emerged into physicality as we understand it, all of those textbooks are still correct. And the chemistry that emerges from that, the biology and the neuroscience and so on, all of it is right. The textbooks don't get thrown away. The underlying assumptions on which they sit adds new elements to these. So among other things, now in physics, you will find that conscious intention will slightly tweak bits of physics. And it will slightly tweak biology, and it will slightly tweak everything all the way up, just like electrons can be found everywhere in this hierarchy of ways of thinking about reality. So if you take that assumption, and by the way, it's not really that different than Einstein's assumption that light only goes one speed. That's like comes a bolt out of the blue, a guess. It turns out that the guess was pretty good. It's a good guess. And by the same token, when Max Planck came up with the idea of the quanta, that energy only comes in little packets, that was not a rational decision. It was a guess. The guess turned out to be really good. So here's another guess. The guess is that consciousness permeates everything. It's simply a background part of the reality, and it emerges into physicality. And in that one stroke, all of the anomalies of psychic phenomena, of mysticism, of magic, suddenly are no longer anomalies. They're things that you can expect and you can test. So that's my riff on that.
I like it. So let's go off of that riff. And one of the things that drives me a little bit batty is this idea that maybe we can bend or affect things a little bit at the quanta level, but not on a more macro level. Is that just a paradigm that at some point we're probably sort of like watching, what is it? Is it Rhonda Byrne's The Secret, where the shaman goes ding and you're able to see the wooden ships, that all of a sudden we're going to go ding and this place changes as we know it?
Yeah, our assumption that we can only influence things at the microscopic level is, in a sense, an affectation. It is part of an assumption that is probably, maybe it's okay to do that because it's so small and it's so far away from our everyday life that maybe that's what's happening. I think that's more of a baby step, in a sense. Just like you see more and more scientists that are entertaining the idea of panpsychism. So panpsychism is still a materialistic concept. It's saying that there is matter and energy out there, but the matter has this peculiar property of matter being sentient in some way. Mm-hmm. It's a quasi-materialistic or quasi-idealistic step toward the notion of consciousness really being fundamental, more fundamental than matter itself and energy. So maybe we're passing through a time where, rather than a paradigm completely breaking overnight, which would throw things into chaos, we take baby steps. And we can see cracks forming in the foundation. And when enough cracks form, then what would seem like overnight actually may take 20 to 50 years for people to get to the idea of saying, oh, okay, all of those things weren't working too well, but now we see that there's some other way of approaching this problem. Mm-hmm. Then it flips, and it could flip very quickly, but it needs a lot of preparation.
Woohoo! Can you tell us about how you personally use this for manifestation, or maybe even this great 4-part synchronicity compressed?
So the 4-part synchronicity is referring to two people both intending at extremely high levels of focus for a length of time. So one of the people was me, and the other was another person. I wanted to manifest a laboratory of a certain type. It would cost a lot of money, certain kinds of equipment in it, and so on. And I didn't have it, but I wanted it, and I was drawing it. So I was drawing it and drawing it on a whiteboard in my office. The other person wanted to manifest me, in the sense that he wanted to contact me, or even better, to have me show up somehow. He didn't know where I was. He had no way of contacting me. He didn't know how to find me, but that's what he wanted. So he was spending a long time with very intense intention to make me show up somehow. And I was trying to pull in a bunch of equipment that I didn't have. So to make a long story short, we ended up with offices right next to each other, completely unbeknownst to me that this other person even existed, but our offices were next to each other, and the wall that had the whiteboard that I was drawing my symbols on, the actual equipment was on the other side of the wall. And so when I met this guy, I opened the door, he practically passed out from shock, because he was in the process of trying to manifest me, and I opened the door and there I was. And he had no idea where I was or how to even contact me. So you can imagine, like most synchronicities, you think of somebody and then you see him on the street or something. This is a little bit worse than that, because this is somebody you have not met before. Like pick your favorite celebrity, mm-hmm. who you're intently focused on, and then one day they open the door and they're standing there. I mean, most people would freak out, as this other guy did. And then when he told me what was going on, I freaked out too, because we all think we have free will, and yet some aspect of this manifestation or synchronistic process is a little bit like planets orbiting each other. They're pulling towards each other. So the drawing process or the spell casting process I imagine, as a pure speculation, that it's something like a gravitational pull. It is a kind of force, but it forces things in a gentle background way so that they come together in just the right way. And that's how most synchronicities are experienced. That just some lucky thing happens. Well, that was a particularly startling 4-part synchronicity, which I think the reason why it happened, you can cast it into pure coincidence, but from a magical perspective, I suspect it was because there are 2 centers of extremely high intention that happened to be compatible with each other, and you could have 2 things solved in one stroke. So the universe may like to solve things easily rather than more difficult, and just made it happen.
Woo! If people are listening today and they want to practice some magic, and everybody who's listening is into the law of attraction, is into manifestation, is there one tool or place based on your experience and what you've tested and what you've learned you'd recommend they start?
Well, meditation, because as I said, these kinds of effects happen at deep levels of awareness. So you need to practice to become comfortable and to be able to sustain moments of awareness where you're no longer in your analytical mind. You're not in like a brain mind anymore. You're in some other existence. So markers that I use for when I know that I'm down at that level and still aware are either a yellow light, kind of a light that seems sort of yellow, although I don't know, it actually has a color to it, but it perfuses everything. So that's one indicator. The other one is the classic Ananda state, where it just feels really good in a strange way. It's not like a sensual feeling, but a feeling of stillness that feels good, and you want to stay there. I can't make those happen very well. I mean, I can do a standard meditation, and sometimes it happens, and sometimes it doesn't. And actually, I don't even know why, other than I think I'm probably disturbed. Mind wandering is happening because of things coming up, and I can find it difficult to drop that. But with enough practice, you can anchor yourself into those states. And once you learn how to go in there and stay there, that's where magic happens. That's where, I mean, it could still probably happen at the level of the surface, because after all, if you're drawing a sigil, you're doing writing magic, that's mostly at the level of the conscious awareness. But you then, if you do it with enough intensity, you can kind of push it down. You push it into your unconscious, and then once it's there, it can start bubbling and working.
Woo! What advice would you give parents? Jessica, my wife, the producer, out in Aspen right now, manifesting, drawing toward her. What advice would you give parents to help their kids in this kind of era of, I want to call it an era of change, because I do think the paradigms are being supplanted, so to speak. People are more open. Things are moving forward here. So how do we help parents with their kids in this new era?
Well, all I can say is, based on my own experience as a child, was that my parents were always supportive of whatever my interests were, provided that they weren't damaging to me or to somebody else. And fortunately, I was never interested in damaging myself or damaging anybody else. So my parents supported. Well, actually, when you're young enough, you don't know what you're interested in. So I was started on the violin very early, and there I do have a talent. So I was put on the concert violinist track very early on because somebody, my teachers and my parents, recognized that I was good at it. So for a long time, that was basically my identity, because a kid doesn't know any better. But at the same time, a parent could also then introduce other things to a child, because maybe they're interested in all kinds of things. So the more you're exposed to, the younger you are, the more likely you'll be able to find what your actual passion is. And that's the thing that you need to follow. So be exposed to many, many different things, and that will help the child.
Woohoo! Thank you, thank you, thank you. On that note, what personally brings you the greatest happiness, or what I call the woohoo woohoo factor?
Well, that's a good question. A really good donut, a donut would do it.
Mhm.
As I get older, I can't tolerate as much sugar as I used to. So having a donut is an unusual situation, and I know I'm going to pay for it uh, later. But yeah, a donut could be really good. By the same token, a really good latte and a donut, double good. Uh, as you can tell, I have simple taste. I don't need large scale things in order to appreciate that I'm alive and reasonably healthy and all the rest.
I can't believe I'm going to do this last minute tangent on us, but I've got to ask on the donut side of things, what does blessed chocolate have to do with anything?
Well, in almost every tradition in the world, you have people who are blessing water, wine, and food. And so the question is, since this goes back way in history, like magical practices do, why do they keep doing it? So one answer is that they're expressing gratitude
Mhm.
for the animals or the plants that are involved in it. Another is that they're praying intently that they're not going to get salmonella and get sick. Another is maybe gratitude to the universe or to God for allowing you to live or something like that. Uh, besides those kinds of blessings, you also have people giving toasts. So the toasts are typically with wine or beer or spirits or some type. That also is a very ancient practice. Well, why? Why do people do that? So one of the possibilities is, and I have chefs who have told me this, that their intention in the practice of cooking
Mhm.
affects how people respond to the food. So if you have a lot of angry people in the kitchen, the food is not going to be as good if you have a lot of loving people in the kitchen. So we did an experiment with chocolate where the chocolate was blessed by Buddhist monks and a Mongolian shaman. And the blessing was specifically that people who ate that chocolate would feel an elevation in their mood, less fatigue and more vigor. And then we had identical chocolate, which was not blessed. And in a double blind, placebo controlled trial, we distributed the blessed and the unblessed chocolate to people, had them record their mood over the course of a week. And then at the end, you can see, did it do anything? Well, yeah, people with the blessed chocolate reported better mood under double blind conditions. So their expectation wasn't pushing it. It apparently was the chocolate that was pushing it. We did the same thing with oolong tea
Mhm.
in China. And then later we did an experiment where we had blessed water used to hydrate seeds of a little mustard plant. And those seeds grew a lot better than the unblessed water. So it's part of a long tradition that substances can be affected by intention as well. You may know that in biodynamic gardening, the Rudolf
Rudolph.
Steiner tradition, that the act of intention is a very important part of growing anything, including making wine, whatever. And of course, it's an alchemical process. The original form of alchemy recognized that consciousness was a part of the practice. And so alchemy, astrology, and herbalism turned into chemistry, astronomy, and the pharmaceutical world, which have left out the consciousness part.
Mhm.
So someday we'll be mature enough to actually put it back in, and then the world will be different.
And I love that you brought up Rudolf Steiner, who is the founder of biodynamic farming, but also of the Waldorf schools.
Yeah.
So when people say we're not into magic, we want to, it's there, it's everywhere. So
Oh, yeah.
the big question is, are you blessing your donuts?
Well, I don't bless the food too much. I consider it a blessing to be able to have a donut. So it already carries the essence of some food, sometimes. But actually, I've learned almost to have a practice of continual gratefulness,
Mhm.
because I really do feel grateful to be able to do the kind of work that I do and be paid for it. So, I mean, to have your living be play is what could be better than that.
Woohoo! All right. Well, here's how would I best put this? I wish you donuts.
Thank you. I will accept the donut.
Where can people go to find out more, to find your beautiful book, Real Magic, and what's the importance of them writing a review?
So you can go to realmagicbook.com,
Mm-hmm.
or you can go to deanradin.com, or you can go to deanradin.org. They will all end up in the same place. The reason why any author, any book should be reviewed on Amazon, hopefully a positive review, but really any review, it should go onto Amazon.com because it's become the one place that people go to get a hit immediately about whether or not they think they want it. We are strongly biased by seeing a bunch of stars on anything. And whether you agree with the Amazon model or not, the fact is that is becoming the de facto place where people go to see whether they want something. So I would like this book, Real Magic, to become a kind of catalyst, which is helping to break the taboo where people are simply able to talk about something that everybody's interested in, but find that they are reluctant to. This is probably more so in the academic world, but you even find it in the general public, that people may be fascinated by magic and even using it. They won't talk about it. So I want to break that taboo. And so the way you do that is to make ideas go viral. And in this case, there's a book that explains in great detail why it is rational. This is not a faith-based or irrational arguments, but simply from a scientific perspective, as best as we know today, magic is real. And as the last line in the book is, let's deal with it.
Woohoo! So come on over to realmagicbook.com, deanradin.com, and deanradin.org. Is that right? Did I get those three correct?
Yep.
If you didn't catch that, come on over to inspirenationshow.com, and we'll get you over to realmagicbook.com, deanradin.com, and deanradin.org, and make sure to get your review in. Before I let you go, well, two quick last things. First off, there's an element of bravery here, Dean. You really stepped forward into this. This sounds like such a strong mission, such a strong calling, that you're actually willing to use that word magic.
Well, for people who, especially for scientists who are pushing against the status quo, from the outside, I can see that it looks like bravery. I don't feel it that way so much. I'm not I'm not a big risk taker. Like, I don't climb mountains and stuff. For me, it feels more like this is the most interesting thing that I know how to do. And so I'm pushed by curiosity. And if it turns out that you also need to be an iconoclast where you don't care too much about what other people think, because you do get a lot of criticism, I decided that I can't please everyone. In fact, if your goal in life is to please people, then you should go along with the status quo. That's definitely what you should do. I never cared about that very much. So maybe because I grew up in an artistic family, and artists are always pushing the limits in terms of the status quo. That's part of what art is about. So for me, it just feels like a natural thing to do. And if it's brave, all right, but that's not how I'm thinking about it. And by the same token, one of the things you would say about a firefighter, for example, somebody running into a burning building, well, that's brave. And a firefighter kind of knows that, but that's not why they're doing it. That's what they want to do.
Woohoo! Any last words of wisdom you want to share with people today? This has been phenomenal, and I want everybody to get your book, and because it's important for everything.
Well, I hope so. But so my final comments would be get a latte and get a donut. Now, I'm not going to say where I go to get those things, but even if you're dealing with you don't want to have too much sugar, like I do all the time, occasionally, in moderation, a latte and a donut could be really nice.
Woohoo! It's been years since I've had a donut, Dean.
Right. So when you choose your donut, very important. You choose your donut. There are some donuts that are just absolutely saturated with sugar. I wouldn't recommend those. They're very tasty, but then you'll pay a big price.
Those have the K with them typically?
Yes. So there are other donuts that are more cake-like an old-fashioned donut.
Yeah.
They feel better because they're not quite as sugary. But even still, you don't want to overdo it.
So this has to do with law of attraction, affirmations, calling things in, drawing them out. We can do the whole show next time on the power of the donut.
Yeah, the drawing in of the donut. I'm sure there's symbolism in there, right? It's the Ouroboros. It's the donut eating itself. There's a whole symbology in there.
And now if we went actually from a donut almost to a fritter shape, we could almost get that infinity symbol of the figure eight doubling back on itself.
All right, now I know what my next book has to be. It's the magic of donuts. I'm gonna write that down.
Woohoo!
Yeah, the magic of donut magic. Okay.
All right. So for everyone out there, this is Michael Sandler saying, be well, have fun, get real magic and a donut, and begin diving into the magic and that donut today. And shine bright. Woohoo! Wow, wow, wow. What another amazing, sacred, special interview. On that note, if you want to dive into something that's sacred and special, then you want to dive into the automatic writing experience. It's a process where you learn how to channel, to go quiet, put pen to paper, and literally get answers from the other side of the veil. Now you can get our video-based program where you can begin learning automatic writing today, along with live classes at automaticwriting.com. On that note, if you're loving the show, then that means you are a mystic. So join Michael's School of Mystics. We meet 4 Wednesdays a month. Simply go to inspirenationuniversity.com and you can find Michael's School of Mystics. On that note, come join us every Monday night. We have YouTube live events. And if you want even more than that, click the join link. Come join the inner circle with me. You get an uplifting dose of goodness in the inner circle with all of the behind the scenes footage and videos that I make specifically for you. We're a podcast too. Find us on iTunes, Spotify, every single place you can get a podcast. You can find the Inspire Nation Show. Click the subscribe button and the bell icon, which will notify you with upcoming shows, YouTube live premieres, and here's the link to the next amazing video. Love you guys so much. Big thumbs up. Leave your comments if you like this. Shine bright. Woohoo! Love you guys.